The coat hit her before she even registered the cold. That was the thing about January in Stormhaven. It did not ease into you. It arrived like something with a grudge, like something that had been waiting outside the door all autumn, and finally decided enough was enough. Mira Ashford stepped out of the car she had borrowed from her business partner, and the wind came off the harbor and walked right through the dress she had also borrowed, a floor-length navy thing that fit perfectly in the chest and nowhere else. She stood on the stone steps of Clarendon Hall and looked up at the lit windows and thought, I do not belong in there. She went in anyway. The Stormhaven Winter Charity Gala had been running for 40 years, which meant it had accumulated the specific weight of an institution, the kind of event where the room's gravitational pull organized itself around old money and older names, where the centerpieces had probably been arranged by the same florist for 3 decades, where the string quartet played pieces that everyone half recognized, and no one had to commit to actually knowing. Mira knew what this room was. She had built buildings for rooms like this. She had restored the plasterwork above rooms like this, had touched the original cornicing with gloved hands, and thought about who else's hands had been there before hers. She understood these rooms architecturally. Socially was a different matter entirely. She took a glass of something from a passing tray, champagne, or the good facsimile of it, and she moved along the wall the way people moved along walls when they were deciding whether to commit to being somewhere. The letter had said she was welcome. The Ashwick Foundation had sent it, the same foundation whose administrator had emailed her 2 years prior, with numbers in a message that she had read standing in her empty office, the last one left in a firm that had been down to 1. She had cried in that office. She had not cried since on principle, or something that felt like principle from the inside. Welcome, the letter had said. She had taken that at face value and come, which was probably the most reckless thing she had done since accepting the grant itself. The room was full of people who looked like they came to rooms like this regularly, which she supposed they did. Mira was 31, and she had the kind of face that was easy to overlook in a crowd, not because there was anything missing from it, but because she did not perform it. She did not work the room. She moved through it the way she moved through buildings she was assessing for the first time, methodically, with attention given to the things most people walked past. The ceiling was original plasterwork, 1887, water damaged in one corner and badly repaired sometime in the 1960s, with a compound that was going to have to come out eventually. She clocked it the way other people clock exits. A man near the bar said something and everyone around him laughed, and the laughter had that particular quality, warm, inclusive, leaning in, that told her the man at the center of it was someone whose attention made people feel chosen. She did not look over. She had spent enough years in rooms adjacent to power to understand that looking over was the first concession, and she was not in the habit of making the first concession to anyone. She found the balcony. The balcony was the kind of architectural decision that made sense on paper. Wide stone parapet, arched threshold, view of the harbor lights reflected cold on the water below, and made considerably less sense in January, when the harbor was black and frozen at the edges, and the wind was doing what the wind was doing. There was no one out there. This was the appeal. Mira went out, closed the glass door behind her, and let herself breathe properly for the first time since arriving. She was shivering within 90 seconds. The dress was doing nothing. The champagne had been a mistake in the direction of warmth because it had given her the impression of warmth, and now the cold was correcting that impression with the kind of thoroughness that January in coastal towns seemed to find satisfying. She gripped the parapet with both hands and looked at the harbor and thought about the Holt Mill building, which was something she thought about when she needed to put her mind somewhere it felt like itself. She had spent 14 months on that building. She had gone in when the walls were soft with water damage and the original brick was buried under 2 layers of paint and a century of bad decisions, and she had come out the other side with something that looked the way it had looked in 1891, which was also the year it had burned and been rebuilt. A building that had a habit of surviving things it had no business surviving. She liked that about it. She did not examine why. The harbor below was making its quiet nighttime sounds, rope against iron, water against stone, the creak of something wooden that ought to have been replaced by now but hadn't been. She listened to it the way she listened to buildings when she was in them alone, for what was speaking underneath the silence. "You're shivering." She turned. He was standing in the threshold, not quite inside, not quite out, which told her something about him immediately. Tall enough that the doorframe registered as a frame around him, the way certain people occupied spaces with a specificity that made everything around them look like it had been arranged to suit them. Dark coat. No expression she could read immediately, or rather an expression that required more time to read than she had yet had. He was looking at her the way someone looks at a situation they have already decided to do something about. She said, "I'm aware." He came out. The cold apparently registered differently for him, or registered the same, and simply did not concern him, which was a specific kind of physical ease she had always found both faintly irritating and, she would admit privately, rather compelling. He stood beside her at the parapet, and he did not look at the harbor. He looked at her for 2 beats, exactly long enough for her to feel it, and then he shrugged off his coat in the unhurried manner of a man who has made a decision and is simply executing it. The coat landed over her shoulders before she had assembled a complete sentence. Black wool, lined with something that had the weight of quality rather than the performance of it. Heavier than she expected, it was warm in a way that meant it had been warm against someone's body moments before, and that warmth went through the borrowed dress like it was correcting something that had been wrong since she had arrived. She said, "I can't take your coat." "You're not taking it," he said. "I'm putting it somewhere temporarily." "That's the same thing." "The distinction matters to me," he said. "So for the time being, we're going with my version." She looked at him. He looked at the harbor. He had the face of someone who had been told all his life that he was a certain kind of person and had decided somewhere along the way to be another kind instead, which was not a thing you could articulate exactly but was something she felt in the way he stood beside her. No performance of himself. No angle from which he was working the room that had extended itself onto the balcony. Just a man on a balcony in January without his coat, apparently unbothered by this. She pulled the lapels closed with both hands. 3 buttons. Brass. She counted them without meaning to, the way she counted cornicing details and mortar joint widths without meaning to. Professional habit, or something that passed for it. "You should go back in," she said. "You'll freeze." "I've been frozen before." There was a pause in which neither of them said what that meant. The harbor lights did their patient thing on the water. Somewhere below, a boat was moored and moving slightly. A gentle sideways drift against its rope. The tension between the two a kind of ongoing negotiation that the rope was winning, barely. "The Holt Mill building," he said. She turned to look at him. The words were specific enough that they had the quality of something deliberate rather than something casual, and she noticed that the way you noticed a mismatched brick in an otherwise consistent course. "I saw the photographs from the restoration," he said. "The original brick, whoever got it back to that condition understood what they were doing. It was her building, her work. She had not said her name to anyone in this room tonight. "You work in architecture," she said. It was not entirely a question. "I work in buildings," he said. "The way other people work in buildings. I'm not the one who knows what to do with them." That was a non-answer, dressed as an answer. She filed it without commenting on it. He did not introduce himself. She did not ask. There was something about the balcony, the cold, the harbor, the specific quality of a conversation happening outside the room where introductions were the entire point, that made the omission feel reasonable instead of rude, like they were both, briefly, permitted to be people who had not been introduced yet rather than people who were defined by where they stood in a room full of name badges. He said after a while, "You should go back in before the champagne stops working." "It's already stopped working." "Then you should go in before you have to admit that." She laughed. It came out before she could do anything about it. Small sound, involuntary, the kind that happened when something was true and funny at exactly the same moment, and she had not expected either the truth or the laugh. She went in. She made it as far as the coat room alcove before she registered that she was still wearing his coat, and she turned back to return it, and the balcony was empty. The glass door stood there with the harbor lights behind it and no one on the other side. She stood in the alcove for a moment with the coat around her shoulders and the warmth of it still doing its work through the wool, and she thought, "I do not know his name." She looked back at the room. The man who had been at the center of the laughter near the bar. She found him now, briefly, across the room, speaking to an older couple with the contained attention of someone who was listening rather than waiting to speak. She caught his profile for 3 seconds, before a cluster of other people moved and obscured the line of sight. She went home wearing the coat. She told herself she would find a way to return it. She would find out his name, and contact the foundation, and return it properly, with a note, professionally. She held the lapels closed with both hands the whole drive, the brass buttons under her fingers, and she did not examine what she was doing, and the harbor disappeared behind her in the dark, and the coat was warm. 2 years earlier, the office had been a room with a lease, 4 desks, and a slowly dwindling reason to exist. Mira had started Ashford Restoration in a rented space on Mercer Lane with her partner Deb, who handled numbers with the same precision that Mira applied to original cornicing, and a hired hand named Cole who could read a wall the way a doctor read a chest, knowing what the surface was concealing, knowing what it would cost you to ignore it. They were 3 people and a good name, and the kind of work that did not attract attention until it was finished, and then attracted exactly the right kind. The Caldwell Commission had kept them going for 18 months. A row of Georgian townhouses on the south end that needed interior restoration without disturbing the listed facades. They did it right. They always did it right. Cole once spent 11 hours removing a single section of original timber ceiling plank because the bracket holding it was corroded in a way that would have taken the next 30 years of that ceiling down with it if they had used a power tool instead of patience. 11 hours. The plank came out intact. It went back in intact. That was the kind of firm they were. The Caldwell Commission ended, and the city contract arrived, and they got to work on the preliminary surveys, and it looked, for about 4 months, like Ashford Restoration was going to be the firm that restored the Pembridge District waterfront. 11 buildings, mixed use, a chunk of the city's original commercial core that had spent 40 years under corrugated metal cladding, and needed someone who understood what was underneath it. They put in the hours on the proposal. Mira surveyed every building herself. She wrote sections of that proposal at 2 in the morning in the site office she had set up in the ground floor of the first building, because being in the space helped her think about it. The building on the corner of Pembridge and Key had its original floor tiles still, buried under 12 millimeters of leveling compound, and 2 generations of vinyl sheeting. She had found them by accident while lifting a damaged section of the vinyl near the skirting board, and had spent 20 minutes on her knees on a cold floor looking at encaustic tiles in a geometric pattern that matched the original council approval drawings from 1884. She had documented them with her phone camera and included the photographs in the proposal with a note. These survive, and can be recovered. Then Commissioner Hadley retired. His replacement came in with his cousin already on the short list. The contract went to a firm from the capital that Mira had never heard of and whose portfolio, when she looked it up with the particular masochism of someone who needed to know the dimensions of their loss, contained nothing that suggested any understanding of what was under those vinyl sheets. She read about it in a newsletter. A newsletter. She sat in the office and looked at the news on her screen, and Deb came in and looked at it over her shoulder, and neither of them said anything for a while. The office was very quiet in the way that offices were quiet when something had gone wrong and the noise of addressing it had not yet started. "We have 14 weeks of runway," Deb said eventually. Mira said, "I know." Cole found another position. She could not have asked him to stay. She let him go with a reference she spent 2 hours writing, because he deserved those 2 hours. And on the day he left, she sat in the office after he had gone, and looked at his empty desk and thought, the firm that does not do right by good people when it is inconvenient to do so is not a firm worth saving. She wrote the reference carefully. She sent it the same day. Then it was 2 desks and a lease and 14 weeks. Deb said, "We apply for everything." They applied for everything. 3 smaller municipal contracts, 2 private restoration inquiries, a heritage trust commission in the next county that would have kept the lights on for 6 months if they had gotten it. They did not get it. Mira built detailed proposals for all of them, each one honest, each one specific, each one demonstrating exactly what Ashford Restoration understood about the kind of work that nobody else was doing the way they were doing it. She filed them and waited, and the waiting was a specific kind of wait that sat behind the sternum, not painful exactly, but always present, the way a bruise was present when you were not touching it. The days had a quality that she recognized from other bad periods of her life, each one arriving fully resolved to be exactly what it was, without mercy or adjustment. She went to work. She applied for things. She waited. She went home. She did not sleep particularly well. The Ashwick Foundation grant application came to her attention through a colleague who had a friend who had received one and described the process as thorough and the outcome as transformative, which were the 2 words Mira most needed to hear at that particular moment in that particular order. She looked at the foundation's funding history for an afternoon before she applied. The Ashwick Foundation funded architectural preservation, adaptive reuse projects, and heritage building research with a specificity that told her whoever was running it actually understood what they were funding, not the broad strokes of institutional arts support. The specific strokes, projects that had required not just money but comprehension. Someone in that foundation had understood that the 1960s extension on a listed Victorian warehouse was not a neutral decision, that removing it was preservation, and leaving it was a choice too, and that both choices cost something. That level of understanding came from someone who had stood inside buildings. She applied. The application asked for a project outline, a firm history, and a personal statement. She spent 3 days on the outline. She spent 4 hours on the history. She spent 40 minutes on the personal statement and deleted it 4 times, because each version was too long, too defensive, Too much of an explanation, and not enough of a reason. What she finally wrote was 2 paragraphs. She wrote about the first building she had ever touched professionally, a warehouse conversion in her 2nd year out of school, a building that had been used as a storage facility for automotive parts for 30 years, and before that had been a textile printing works, and before that, before the cladding and the refit and the conversion and the loss, had been something that stood on its own terms and said something about the city that built it. She had pulled back a section of interior cladding and found the original timber beneath it. Old-growth timber, untouched since 1883. The kind of wood that did not exist anymore, because the trees that grew it did not exist anymore. She had stood in that warehouse with a crowbar in her hand and understood, for the first time clearly, that her job was not building. Her job was recovering things that people had tried to bury, not out of malice most of the time, but out of the simple human tendency to address the present by covering the past. She wrote, "The building deserves better than what it got." She meant the warehouse. She also meant every building like it. She did not write the second meaning because grant applications were not the place for large things, and because the truth that lived inside that sentence was the kind of truth that either landed or it did not, and no amount of elaboration would change which. She filed the application on a Sunday afternoon, and did not think about it for 3 weeks. Then she thought about it constantly for the following 5 weeks, which was the honest account of how that period of time passed. The letter came on a Tuesday. She was in the office alone, the second desk empty and clean, in a way that still looked like absence rather than arrangement. She read the letter standing up because she had been walking toward her desk when her phone screen lit with the notification, and she had stopped mid-step and read it there, in the middle of the floor, in her coat still because the heat in the building was unreliable, and January in Stormhaven made unreliable heating its own kind of problem. The grant was approved, 18 months of operational funding. The number was the kind of number that did not parse cleanly on first reading, that required a second reading to confirm that the decimal point was where she thought it was. She sat down on the floor. Not in the chair, on the floor, between the 2 desks, in her coat, with the letter in both hands. Deb arrived 20 minutes later, found her still there, read the letter, and sat down on the floor beside her. They sat like that for a while, which was not professional behavior, but was the most honest response either of them could produce. "Who reviewed the application?" Deb asked. "I don't know," Mira said. "The letter's from an administrator, Helena Briggs. I've never heard of her. Are we going to find out?" "They said anonymous giving was a condition of the grant," Mira said. "Direct beneficiary outreach to individual foundation trustees was discouraged." "Discouraged," Deb said. "Not prohibited, but discouraged." "We're going to do the work," Mira said. "We're going to do the work so well that it doesn't matter who read the application." She got off the floor. She called Cole. He came back. The Holt Mill building was a 4-story textile mill on the harbor's northeast edge that had operated continuously from 1878 until 1961, changed hands 14 times in the following century, and spent the last 20 years divided between a storage facility and a question nobody had found the resources to answer. The original brick on the harbor-facing elevation was intact under 2 layers of render. The original timber roof structure was largely present under a flat roof addition from 1974 that was doing nothing but holding water. Mira surveyed it herself before bringing anyone else in. She went alone on a February morning and walked every floor and touched every wall and understood, in the particular way she understood buildings she was going to spend a long time with, what it needed and what it had survived and what it would require of her. The restoration took 14 months. Helena Briggs replied to every email within 24 hours and approved every stage of work with a decisiveness that told Mira the approvals were not being made by Helena Briggs alone, but she did not ask. She worked. The original brick came back. The timber roof structure came back. The Holt Mill Heritage Prize came to her at a small ceremony in the mill's own restored ground floor, and the speech she gave was short because she was not good at long speeches in rooms where people were watching her with expectations. The prize came with money. She donated a quarter of it back to the Ashwick Foundation. Helena Briggs sent 2 sentences in acknowledgement, professional, warm in the calibrated way of professionally warm communications. It told her nothing about who had decided that the building deserved better than what it got was a sentence worth funding. She had a coat now, in her front closet. She was aware of it the way you were aware of a structural problem you had documented and not yet addressed. Always there in the inventory, always waiting for its turn. She was 3 days away from driving to the Ashwick Foundation's offices to return it to a man whose name she still did not know, and she did not know what was going to happen when she got there. Except that she was already moving in that direction the way buildings move toward the ground when the supports gave out, not falling, not exactly. Just following the only honest direction available to them. In those 3 days she worked on the Coastal District intake files, organized the Holt Mill post-restoration documentation for the Heritage Archive, and did not think about the coat in any deliberate way, which meant she thought about it constantly in the peripheral manner of someone trying not to look at something directly. Deb noticed most things. It was the same cognitive quality that made her exceptional with numbers, the ability to see what the surface was doing and know it was doing something else underneath. "You've been very focused this week," Deb said on the third day, which was the particular phrasing Deb used for the concept of ostentatiously not asking a question. "I'm always focused," Mira said. "You've been focused at the window," Deb said. The window looked east, toward the harbor. The Holt Mill building was on the harbor's northeast edge. This was not relevant information, except that it was. Mira went back to her screen. That evening she took the coat out of the front closet and held it across both arms and looked at it in the hallway light. It was a good coat. The wool was a fine gauge, dense enough to block wind without being stiff, and the lining was silk rather than the synthetic version that announced itself by sounding like weather when you moved. Someone had made choices about this coat. The choices had been about quality and longevity rather than appearance, which told her something about the person who had worn it, that they chose things for what they were rather than for what they signaled. She hung it back up. She thought about a Sunday afternoon and the specific weight of being the reason someone made a fast decision. In the morning she drove to Quay Street. She told herself she was returning the coat. The Ashwick Foundation occupied the top 2 floors of a building on Quay Street that she had assessed for listing consideration in her 3rd year out of school and decided was mid-tier Victorian commercial. Decent bones, nothing exceptional. The kind of building that survived not by being remarkable, but by being useful enough to keep and not interesting enough to demolish. She stood outside it on a Tuesday at 9 in the morning, with the folded coat over her arm, and she looked up at the facade and thought that they had recently repointed the upper stonework and done it well. The mortar was the right color, the right consistency, not too crisp, not too soft, and the joints were flush in a way that told her the person who had hired for that work had known what competent pointing looked like. Someone in this foundation paid attention. The woman at the front desk was young and efficient and told her that the foundation did not receive unscheduled visitors, and that if she would like to leave the coat she could certainly do that. Mira said she would prefer to return it directly. The woman said she understood, but the foundation's trustees were generally not available for unscheduled. The door behind the desk opened. He came out carrying a folder and talking to someone over his shoulder, mid-sentence, and he stopped when he saw her. Not a dramatic stop. The quiet kind. The kind where the body simply arrives at stillness without announcing it. He looked at the coat on her arm. Something moved across his face that was over before she could name it. Some precise internal adjustment that he had the self-possession not to perform outward. And then he said, "Come through." The woman at the desk looked up with the mild surprise of someone for whom this was unusual. Mira noted the surprise the way she noted structural anomalies. Informative. She followed him. His office was the corner room, which she had known it would be because people like him always had the corner room, but the room itself was not what she had composed in her head on the way over. She had expected the institutional version, the kind of office that communicated authority through scale and sparseness, the kind that required you to cross a meaningful amount of floor before you arrived at the desk. That was not this office. The wall behind his desk was bookshelves floor to ceiling, architecture, structural engineering, heritage practice, conservation law arranged by subject rather than by the decorative consideration that drove alphabetical arrangement in offices where books were props. There were journals she recognized, Heritage and Society, the International Journal of Architectural Heritage, with the broken spines of things that had been read rather than displayed. She noted a volume on Scottish rubble stone construction that she had her own heavily annotated copy of somewhere in the Ashford Restoration Library. There were drawings on the other wall, original technical drawings, framed, the kind of work done before computers made precision effortless and therefore common. Blueprints in the original sense, white lines on blue, hand-lettered dimensions in the careful script of someone who understood that the lettering was as much a document as the line work. 5 frames, large format. She stopped in front of them before she could stop herself, and she stood very close, reading the title block of the nearest one. Holt Mill Buildings, Plan of Ground Floor. Dated June 1878. The draftsman's name was in the lower right corner in the same hand as the dimensions, W. Allison. She turned around. He was standing beside the desk. The folder was on it. He was watching her in the way that she had noted on the balcony. direct, without performance, with the specific quality of attention that made you feel that whatever you said next would be genuinely considered rather than filed and processed. You have the original construction drawings, she said. The foundation does, yes. I requested those through the Heritage Archive 18 months ago. They told me the builder's copies hadn't been located. A pause that lasted exactly long enough to be honest. We had them, he said. The foundation was in the process of cataloging them when your request came through. They were included in the archive transfer 8 months ago. I apologize that the coordination was not better timed. She looked at the drawings on his wall. Then she looked at him. The archive transfer, she said, which you organized. The foundation organized it, yes. She let that stand. You told me your name on the balcony, she said. I didn't, actually. I know you didn't. I'm noting that I noticed. He said after a moment. Calder Ashwick. She had known it. In the specific way you knew something when the evidence had been accumulating without your explicit consent. She had known it from the blueprints. She had known it from the way the woman at the desk had looked when he said come through. She had known it, she thought, in some ambient and not yet surfaced way, from the moment he had appeared in the balcony threshold and looked at her situation, with the expression of a man who had already decided what to do about it. She put the coat on the chair beside her. Thank you for the use of it, she said. He looked at the coat, then at her. Sit down, he said, please. She sat. He sat on the other side of the desk, and the folder stayed where it was, and he said, the 1887 fire. The rebuild. You found evidence of it in the structural sequence? That was not what she had come here for. She had come to return a coat, say thank you, and leave without creating any additional complexity in what was already a professional relationship with a complication she had not yet fully named. She had not come here to talk about the 1887 fire scar. But the question was precise, and she was not capable of not answering precise questions about buildings she had worked on. She said, the west elevation showed evidence of a heat event in the mortar joints between courses 5 and 6 from the base. The brick above the heat line was replaced in the rebuild. The replacement was fired from a slightly different clay composition, probably from a different supplier. The color match was close, but the firing temperature had been lower, which you could read in the surface texture. The original and the replacement brick were about 30 years apart in their material properties. He nodded slowly. He was listening with the quality of someone listening for detail rather than listening for the general shape of what was being said. The insurance survey from 1888 mentions a partial rebuild, he said. Ground and first floor west, 7 bays. I have the survey document in the archive if you need it for the heritage record. She looked at him. He was saying this the way people said things when they had been thinking about them for a long time, carefully, with the compressed weight of information held in readiness for the right recipient. How do you have the insurance survey? She said. The foundation acquired the building records when we took over the stewardship in 2019. She heard what was under that sentence. She made herself say it directly. You own Holt Mill. The foundation holds it in a heritage stewardship trust. The distinction is meaningful legally. But you funded the restoration, she said, of a building you hold. The foundation funded a project proposed by an independent firm on the merits of its approach. The firm did not know about the foundation's connection to the building when it applied. That was deliberate on our part. He looked at her without flinching from it. I'm telling you this now because you have clearly already begun to put the arithmetic together. She had. The arithmetic was working with the relentless efficiency of arithmetic that had been waiting for all its variables to arrive in the same room. The building he held, the grant she received, the drawings on his wall, the specific weight of his questions. The application was reviewed by you personally, she said. The foundation reviews all applications collectively. You reviewed mine personally. A pause. He said, the foundation process involves multiple evaluators. That's a different sentence than the one I said. He looked at her, the look of a man who had decided before she arrived how much of this conversation he was going to have today, and had arrived at a number and was holding to it. She let it go. For now. The conversation did not end the way she had planned it. It went on for another 35 minutes in which he asked about the Holt Mill documentation with the depth and sequence of someone who had been assembling questions for a long time, the timber roof analysis, the decision process behind the fabricated replacement beams, the pigmentation survey she had commissioned for the original brick. She answered because the questions were good, and because she was constitutionally incapable of giving half answers to good questions about buildings she had worked on. It was not a quality she could switch off. At some point she forgot the coat was on the chair. He said there was a building in the coastal district, a waterfront granary from the 1860s, rubble stone, maritime salt infiltration in the original lime mortar, A structural problem that was getting quieter rather than louder, which was the most dangerous kind. She said she knew a great deal about maritime salt infiltration in rubblestone. He said he was not surprised, which landed in the room with the weight of something that meant more than it said. She agreed to look at the property. She stood, and she reached for the coat, and she was 3/4 of the way to picking it up when she stopped. She left it. She did not know why. It was not a considered decision. It was a gap between what she intended and what she did. The kind that happened when the body understood something the mind had not caught up to yet. She said goodbye and she walked out of the office and through the front desk, and down the stairs, and out onto Quay Street. And she stood in the cold for a moment with nothing around her shoulders. She walked to her car. She drove 3 blocks and then she pulled over because she needed to sit still for a moment, and the road was not a good place for the kind of sitting still that was required. He had been there. Behind all of it, the application process, the administrator's emails, the measured approvals of every stage of the Holt mill work, present the whole time, invisible and present simultaneously, which was a combination she understood architecturally, because it was the condition of original fabric hidden under render, still there, still doing structural work, just not visible to anyone who wasn't looking at the right evidence. She sat in the parked car and looked at the buildings on either side of her. 1920s commercial brick, she registered automatically. The one on the left had been re-windowed badly. The proportions of the replacement frames were wrong by about 15%, the kind of wrong that you could only identify if you had spent time looking at original examples and could feel the deviation before you could name it. The one on the right still had its original windows. She could tell from 50 feet. The glass caught the light the way modern glass did not, a slight imperfection in the surface that was actually the depth of age. She thought about the coat. She had left it in his office. She turned the car around and went back. Clara, the woman at the front desk, received her return with the expression of a person stretching professional neutrality past its rated capacity. "I left something in Mr. Ashwick's office," Mira said. "He doesn't need to know I'm here. It's just the coat." Clara went back. She returned with the coat and held it out with the bearing of someone who had opinions and was choosing, firmly, not to have them on company time. Mira took the coat. She walked back to her car. She put it in the passenger seat. She sat in the driver's seat and looked at it. Black wool, 3 brass buttons facing up, cedar smell filling the small space of the car within seconds. She had gone to return it and come back with it again. That was simply the factual account of the morning. She drove to the office. Deb was at her desk with her reading glasses on and a set of cost projections on the screen, and she looked up when Mira came in and said, "How did it go?" "Fine. Did you return the coat?" Mira sat at her desk. She put the coat over the back of her chair, which felt different from the front closet hook in a way she chose not to examine. "I'm going to look at a granary building in the coastal district," she said. 1860s waterfront structure. Rubblestone, maritime salt infiltration. Deb took off her reading glasses. "Mira, it's exactly the kind of work we do. Who's the client?" Mira turned to her screen. "The Ashwick Foundation." Deb put her glasses back on. She said, "Okay." "Okay? I have opinions. I'm choosing not to say them yet." "That's mature of you." "I know," Deb said. "I'm extremely mature." Mira pulled the Coastal District granary files onto her screen. A message was already there from Helena Briggs, specific, professional, the salt infiltration timeline outlined in the kind of detail that required familiarity with the source materials. He had sent it while she was still driving back. She read it twice and replied, professionally, within the hour. She did not mention the coat. She did not mention the coat for the rest of the day, and it stayed over the back of her chair while she worked, and at 6 in the evening she moved it to the hook by the drafting table, the hook where things that mattered to active work went, and she stepped back and looked at it. The hook by the drafting table was where she put things she needed close. She turned off her desk lamp and stood in the dimmer light and looked at the coat on the hook and thought, I know what the 1887 fire scar looks like in the mortar joints of a building he has been thinking about for 5 years, and I do not know what it means that he asked about it the way he did, which was the way people asked about things they had been saving for someone specific. She went home. She thought about the way he had said the west elevation and the weight of readiness in it. She did not return the coat. She found out the way you found out most things that changed your life, not from the person involved, not from a conversation designed to give her the information in a way she could metabolize at a reasonable pace. She found out from a journalist named Owen Carey who wrote a piece for the Stormhaven Heritage Review about the Ashwick Foundation's decade of private philanthropy, which ran on a Thursday morning and appeared in her inbox as a forwarded email from Deb with no subject line. No subject line from Deb was a specific form of communication. It meant the content required no editorial framing because the content was either remarkable or terrible, and Deb trusted Mira to determine which without assistance. The article was 3,000 words on how the foundation had spent 10 years funding preservation projects that would not have survived conventional funding routes, too niche, too speculative, too focused on the kind of work that produced outcomes in decades rather than financial quarters. Owen Carey had done thorough research. He had spoken to foundation staff, former applicants, committee members who had either retired or moved to other positions and were willing to speak about the internal process from that comfortable distance. He named 6 projects in detail. He named the firms that had carried them out. He named the trustees who had championed each one through the internal approval process, where normal procedure assigned applications to committees, and the committee moved at the pace of committees. The third project was Holt Mill. The trustee cited by name was Calder Ashwick. Owen Carey had written, Ashwick personally reviewed the application within hours of its submission and moved it to the top of the evaluation queue, an unusual step that bypassed the standard 30-day review window. When asked about the decision, he noted only that the project met the foundation's criteria for timely intervention. Former committee members suggest the decision reflected his long-standing connection to the Holt Mill property and a specific interest in finding the right firm for its restoration. She read that paragraph twice. She read the whole article twice, from the beginning, sitting at a table in the coffee shop on Mercer Lane where she went on mornings she needed to think before the office arrived around her, with its ordinary demands. She put her phone face down on the table and looked at the wall across from her. The wall was painted brick, a deep charcoal, and someone had done a decent job of pointing the joints, but the corner to her left had been filled with the wrong compound. Too rigid, which meant in 3 or 4 years it would crack and pull moisture with it as it went. She looked at that corner for a while, personally reviewed the application within hours of its submission. She had submitted the application on a Sunday afternoon. She remembered that Sunday. The submission had cost her something she had not known she had left to give, because submitting a grant application when it was the last real option was a different act than submitting one when there were other options standing behind it. She had sat in her kitchen for an hour afterward doing nothing particularly useful and then gone to bed and not slept well, and told herself it was the uncertainty rather than anything more specific. He had read it the same day. She thought about a man reading her words. The building deserves better than what it got, on a Sunday afternoon, on a day when she did not know he existed, and deciding within hours that the application belonged at the top. She thought about all the emails from Helena Briggs, 2 years of them, professional, specific, consistently warm in the calibrated way of people who communicated warmth as a function rather than an accident. She had thought it was a well-run foundation. She had thought the efficiency was institutional, the sign of an organization that understood the value of responsive communication with the people it supported. She had not thought that the efficiency might be one person choosing, for particular reasons, to respond with particular speed to particular correspondence. She thought about his office, the Holt Mill construction drawings on the wall, W. Allison's hand lettering in the title block, the insurance survey from 1888, which he had offered her with the easy availability of someone who had known he would be offering it. She thought about the gala, the threshold, the coat landing over her shoulders before she had a complete sentence ready. She went home. She found the coat in the front closet, on the hook, 3 brass buttons. She stood in front of the open closet for a moment, then she sat down on the floor of the hallway in front of it, which was the honest response and also, she recognized, not entirely a dignified one. The hallway floor was cold through her jeans. She sat there anyway. She was not touched. She understood very clearly why she was not touched. A man with resources choosing where to put them, choosing based on the quality of an application. That was one thing. That was a foundation doing what foundations did, through a trustee who had exercised judgment and used the word timely instead of personal in the conversation with Owen Carey. She could set that in its professional context and be appropriately grateful and move forward. What she could not move forward from, what would not stay in its context, was the office. The office conversation had not been the conversation of a patron confirming the satisfactory completion of a project. It had been the conversation of a person who had been reading about something for a long time and had arrived at the room where the primary source was sitting and could not, quite, maintain the professional distance he had probably intended to maintain. The 1887 fire scar, the mortar joints between courses 5 and 6, the quality of his attention when she described the replacement brick, lower firing temperature, different clay composition, readable in the surface texture. He had absorbed it with the concentration of someone for whom the detail was not new information but was confirmed information. the satisfaction of a fact sliding into the place that had been waiting for it. She had felt, in that office, the specific thing she had not felt in many years of doing her work, the sense that someone understood exactly what the work was for. She had felt it as a professional recognition. She was now required to examine whether it had also been something else. The anger came. Not hot, not loud, the slow, steady, deeply familiar kind that rose from the base of her chest and settled into a reliable weight, a known thing, a thing she had used before when the feelings underneath were too large to navigate directly. The anger was almost a relief after the discomfort of the floor and the coat and the realization that she had been sitting here for longer than she had registered. She was angry at him for the secrecy. Straightforward, required no further examination. She was angry at herself for the office conversation, for having felt heard in a way she had not prepared for and had not managed to remain neutral about, and was now finding attached to a set of facts that changed its context. She was angry, with a specificity she did not particularly enjoy examining, at the possibility that the listening had been something other than what it felt like, that it might have been the attention of a man watching over an investment, the interest of a property trustee reviewing outcomes. She could not now disentangle the feeling from that possibility, and the tangling was the worst part. She put the coat on. The hallway. 9 in the evening. She reached up, pulled it off the hook, and shrugged it on over her clothes, and the weight of it settled on her shoulders the same way it had settled on the balcony, that particular warmth that went into you without announcement. She stood in her own hallway wearing a coat that was not hers, and that she had now returned twice without successfully returning. She stood there. 3 buttons. The same 3. She had known there were 3 since January and was still counting them. She thought about the article. Long-standing connection to the Holt Mill property. He had chosen that word. Connection. Not ownership, not stewardship, not investment. Connection, which was the word people used for things that had cost them something. She took the coat off. She folded it with the care she gave to things that were other people's property and set it on the hallway table. She went to her kitchen. She made tea and did not drink it, and stood at the counter, and looked at the window where the harbor was not visible, because her flat was 2 streets back from the water, and the angle was wrong. The options were simple enough that they clarified themselves while she stood there. She could continue professionally, as if the article had not been published, correspond with Helena Briggs about the Coastal District Granary, deliver the preliminary survey report on schedule, do excellent work, and allow the professional layer to insulate her from everything underneath it. This was the option with the most structural integrity and the least honesty, and she had never in her professional life chosen form over function. She was going there in the morning. She decided it the way she decided things when the decision had already been made, and she was simply locating the moment of her own certainty. She was going to Quay Street in the morning, and she was going to say she knew, and she was going to listen to whatever he said in response to that, and she was not going to let the anger do her talking, because the anger was the thing she used when she was frightened. And she was not frightened. She was somewhat frightened. Not of him, not of the conversation, of the specific thing the conversation might confirm or deny about the morning in his office, which had felt like a particular kind of being known and which she could not afford to discover had been anything other than what it felt like. She went to bed. She lay in the dark. She thought about the coffee shop corner, the wrong compound in the mortar joint, the inevitable cracking. She thought about buildings that managed their own deterioration. The ones that gave up the softer material first, the render, the pointing, so that the stone beneath could stay whole. She thought about the granary and its salt infiltration, the lime mortar doing its slow, patient work of sacrifice. She thought, a man who had been reading about that building for 5 years chose a Sunday afternoon to read about it from her angle instead. She thought about that for a long time. She thought about what it meant that he had known who she was on the balcony, and had not said so, and had given her his coat anyway, and had left before she could give it back, and that all of those choices had been made in the same 30-minute window. She thought about a man in a threshold deciding that being someone she talked to on a balcony was preferable to being the man who funded her firm, and whether that choice was a self-interested one or the other kind, and could not resolve it. She thought about coming to his office the first time and the drawings on the wall, W. Allison, 1878, white lines on blue, and the particular quality of standing in front of them with her back to him while he waited. She thought about how the room had rearranged itself around that moment, the books and the files and the professional distance of it all, and how none of it had survived the specificity of the questions he asked about the fire scar, the west elevation, courses 5 and 6, lower firing temperature and the replacement brick. She had answered him like she always answered good questions about buildings she had worked on, which was completely and without reservation, which was possibly the most revealing thing she had ever done in a professional setting, and she had not recognized it as such until now, lying in the dark 3 weeks later. The anger was still there, steady and reliable at the base of her chest. She appreciated it. She was also, she admitted, tired of only having the anger. It was a limited tool. It was the right tool for certain jobs. It had gotten her off the floor of the hallway and out of the coffee shop and into the car. But it was not the tool for the thing she was actually going to have to do tomorrow, which was stand in a room with a man who had kept a significant secret for 2 years, and tell him she knew about it, and then listen to what he said, and then make a decision about what the listening meant. The anger was not going to make that decision for her. She would have to be the one who made it. In the morning she got up and made coffee and picked up the folded coat from the side table and went to her car, and she was wearing it by the time she was 3 blocks from Quay Street, and she noticed this and decided that noticing it was optional information, something she was free to register and then not act on by way of removing the coat and putting it on the passenger seat, which she was choosing not to do. She walked the last 2 blocks in his coat in a January that was still conducting its business with the same disregard for other people's plans that it had maintained all season. She did not change her mind. The woman at the front desk, Clara, small silver letters on her name badge, looked up when Mira pushed through the door, and there was a flicker of something in her expression that had evolved since the first visit. No longer polite neutrality. Something closer to recognition, edged with the particular weariness of a person who had become, against their professional intentions, a witness to a situation they were not formally part of. Mira said, "I don't have an appointment." Clara said, "I'll let him know you're here." She picked up the phone and said something into it quietly, and then looked up and said, "He says to go through." Mira went through. He was standing at the window when she opened the office door, not behind the desk, at the window that looked out over Quay Street, and he turned when she came in and he looked at her and then he looked at the coat she was wearing and something crossed his face that was faster and more complete than she could follow, some involuntary internal accounting that resolved itself before she could read it. She said, "I read the article." He said, "I know." 2 words, not a defense, not an explanation. The specific flatness of a person who had been waiting for a thing to arrive and was acknowledging its arrival, nothing more. She did not sit down. She stood in the middle of the room, his construction drawings on one wall, his bookshelves on the other, the coat still on her shoulders, and she said, "Tell me what's true." He said, "The application was very strong. You said that before, in this office. The first time. It's still true. It's not an answer to what I'm asking." He was quiet. He looked out the window for a moment, at Quay Street carrying on its ordinary morning, with no awareness of what was happening 2 floors above it. Then he turned back and he said, "What would you like me to say? Something you haven't already decided to say." He was still for a moment. She had come to understand that his stillness was not the stillness of someone composing a careful response. It was the stillness of a person who was already certain of what they wanted to say, and was deciding whether today was the day to say it. He said, "You wrote that the building deserved better than what it got. I had been thinking the same thing for 5 years. Not in those words. I didn't have those words. But the sentence landed the way a sentence lands when it names something you've been carrying without a name. I read it on a Sunday afternoon and I read it 4 times, which is not the standard evaluation process." She said nothing. "I moved it to the top of the queue," he said, "because it was the right decision. Because the application demonstrated both technical ability and a framework for understanding why the work mattered, which was rarer than the technical ability alone. That part was not personal." "And the rest?" she said. He looked at her. Outside the window, a delivery vehicle reversed around the corner and made its reversing sounds and moved on. The harbor was present somewhere past the rooftops, doing what harbors did in January. The rest, he said, was a great deal harder to separate from the professional rationale. She held the lapels closed with both hands. 3 buttons. She was aware of counting them, aware that she was doing it, and choosing not to stop. "The gala," she said. "You knew who I was." "Yes. You knew who I was and you said nothing." "I said you were shivering," he said. "That was accurate. You gave me your coat and left before I could give it back." He said, "I gave you my coat, and then the situation became one I didn't know how to continue honestly, so I didn't continue it." She looked at him. "That's a peculiar definition of honesty." "It was the best version of it I could manage that evening," he said, "which I recognize is not a very strong defense." She let that sit. She was holding on to the anger because the anger was steady and the thing underneath it was not, and she needed something steady to stand on while she figured out where she was. "You asked me about the 1887 fire scar," she said. "In this office. When I came to return the coat the first time, you asked about it like it was something you had been waiting to ask. It was. You knew the answer. You had the insurance survey. I knew what happened, he said. I didn't know what it looked like in the evidence. I didn't know it was readable in the mortar between the 5th and 6th courses, or that you could determine the firing temperature of the replacement brick from the surface texture. I had the documentary record. You had the building. He paused. Those are not the same thing. She was very still. I had been standing outside that building for 5 years, he said, looking at what was there and knowing what had been there and not having the understanding to get from one to the other. And then you applied, and the application said, in the plainest terms, that you understood what buildings were for. Not just structurally. That you understood why recovering them mattered. He stopped. Then he said, and I had absolutely no framework for the fact that that mattered to me in a way that was not strictly related to the Foundation's stewardship responsibilities. The room was very quiet. She stood in the middle of it in his coat, and she held the lapels, and she thought about 14 months in a building that he had been watching from a distance for 5 years before her. She thought about the original brick coming back, ochre and amber and deep reddish brown in the courses above the 1887 fire line, and she thought about walking through the finished ground floor at the end of the restoration and touching the wall with her palm flat against the surface the way you touched a wall when you needed to know if the work was real or just cosmetic. It had been real. She had known that standing there alone in the finished space, before anyone had seen it, before the prize committee or the heritage journalists or anyone with an external stake. She had known because she could feel it in the quality of the silence, the particular silence of a building that was doing what it was supposed to do, holding its own weight honestly. She thought about a man walking through that same space and standing in front of the recovered brick for 20 minutes. She thought about what it would feel like to have watched something you cared about be too broken to help for years and then see it whole. She felt something tear loose in her chest, not painfully, the way things release when the tension holding them was the wrong kind of tension, and it finally gives. She said, "Why didn't you tell me?" He said, "Because every time I was close to telling you, you were in the middle of something that told me something new about you, and I needed to know it before I complicated it. The application told me you were good. The Holt Mill restoration told me what good actually looked like when you did it. The gala told me you went outside to breathe in January rather than stay and manage a room. The office told me you would forget you were returning a coat if I asked you the right question." He stopped. Then, with the flatness of a man saying a true thing simply, "I kept choosing to know you before I let you know what I knew." She said, "That's a generous account of what was also 2 years of not telling me something relevant." "Yes," he said. "I'm not angry about it." "I know." She let out a breath. She took the coat off. She walked to where he was standing and she held it out and he took it, and for one moment the coat passed between them, her hands and his hands and the black wool between, and then it was in his hands, and she was standing without it, and the office air was immediately cooler, which was simply physics. She said, "I'm going to go." He said, "All right. I need time with this. I know." "Please stop saying I know," she said. "I need you to say something you are less certain of." He was quiet for a moment, then he said, "I don't know what you're going to do with what I've told you. I don't know if the professional relationship is recoverable. I don't know if anything else is possible given what I let the professional relationship be." He looked at her directly. "I know that the Coastal District Granary has maritime salt infiltration in the original rubble stone, and that I do not know what to do about it without the right person. And I know who the right person is." She put her hand on the doorframe. She stopped with her back to him. She said, "To the door. The west elevation fire scar, between courses 5 and 6 from the base. You asked about it, like you had been saving the question for a long time." He said, "I had." She went out. Clara did not look up as she crossed the front office, but her shoulders had the particular quality of someone who was deliberately not looking at something. Mira went down the stairs and through the door and onto Quay Street, and the January air came back to her immediately. She was shivering within 60 seconds. She stood on the pavement and the cold came off the harbor through 2 streets of buildings and the coat was 4 floors above her in a man's hands and she did not go back. She walked to her car. She sat in the driver's seat and she looked at the passenger seat where the coat had been this morning, and the absence was the kind of absence that had shape to it, that you could measure the edges of. She drove to the office. Deb looked at her arms when she came through the door. "You returned it." "Yes." "Properly this time?" Mira sat at her desk. She pulled the Coastal District survey files onto her screen, because the granary report was due at the end of the week, and the building needed the work regardless of everything else, and the building's need was the only uncomplicated thing in the current situation. He read my application the day I submitted it, she said. He moved it to the top of the evaluation queue the same day. Deb said, carefully, I know, the article. He walked through the restored Holt Mill ground floor. He said he stood in front of the brick for 20 minutes. Deb was quiet for a moment. Then she said, Mira, I know. What are you going to do? Mira opened the Coastal District files. The granary survey photographs were there, arranged chronologically from her site visit. The rubble stone walls, the salt crystallization patterns at the base of the north elevation, the original lime mortar doing its slow work of sacrificing itself to the salt so the stone did not have to. It was a building that had been managing its own condition for 160 years through a system of controlled deterioration, giving up the right material in the right order to protect the structure underneath. It was, if you thought about it, a sophisticated form of endurance. She said, I'm going to finish the survey report, and then I'm going to not know for a while. That's reasonable, Deb said. I think so. Deb put her glasses on. She went back to her screen. The office did its ordinary thing around them, the radiator clicking, the harbor sounds coming through the window on the days the wind was right, the small professional sounds of two people working in a space they had rebuilt from nothing. At 2 in the afternoon, Helena Briggs emailed about the survey timeline. Mira replied within the hour. Professional. Thorough. The salt infiltration analysis outlined in a way that demonstrated she had been thinking carefully about the building's specific condition and what it required. Nothing about Quay Street. Nothing about the coat. Nothing about a man who had moved her application to the top of a queue on a Sunday afternoon 2 years ago, because a sentence she had written without knowing who would read it had landed somewhere specific. At 4:15 she got a courier notification. A package for pickup at reception. Sender, Ashwick Foundation, Quay Street. She went downstairs. The box was wrapped in plain brown paper. She carried it back to the office and set it on her desk, and Deb looked at it and did not say anything, which was its own comment. She opened it. The coat, folded with the precision of someone who had done it carefully, or who had instructed someone else to do it carefully. Pressed, the wool still warm to the touch in the way that recently finished wool was warm. He had sent it within hours of her leaving it in his hands, which meant he had had it attended to and dispatched the same afternoon, which meant the decision to return it had been immediate and certain. No note. Not a line, not a word. Just the coat. She sat with it in her lap for a long time. The absence of a note was the note, she understood that. He had sent it back because not sending it would have meant choosing his own position over her warmth, which was not something he was capable of. She had understood that on the balcony in January, when he had taken off his coat without asking and left before she could refuse it. He was not a man who weighed his own comfort against other people's cold and came out ahead. He had sent it because returning it was the honest thing, the only thing that didn't reach after her into the space she had said she needed. She stood up. She went to the hook by the drafting table. The hook where the active site plans went, the things in current process, the things that mattered to the work that was alive right now. She hung the coat on it. She stepped back and looked at it. Her drafting table was behind her with the Coastal District Granary Survey spread across it. The Holt Mill documentation was in the filing cabinet against the far wall. 2 years of work in folders organized by phase. The whole history of a building recovered. The Ashwick Foundation correspondence was in her email. 2 years of Helena Briggs. Every exchange professional and specific, and now differently readable. The coat on the hook. She went back to her desk. She drew for 6 hours without looking up, which was the particular form of concentration she reached when she was working on something real. Not the surface form of work, but the deep kind, where the building's logic moved through her without friction, and the decisions arrived cleanly, and the hours passed without announcing themselves. It was the best she felt, in any hour of her life, working that way. At 11 she turned off the lights. She put on her own coat, ordinary, unremarkable, hers in all the ways that mattered, and she crossed to the hook by the drafting table and she stood there for a moment in the dark. The coat, cedar smell still there, faint now, the kind of faint that was on its way to being a memory of a smell. 3 brass buttons in the dark. She had known there were 3 since January. She left it hanging. She went home and she lay in the dark and she thought about a building that had burned and been rebuilt in 1887, and that someone had been looking at through windows for 5 years not knowing how to help it. And she thought about being the person who had known how to help it. And she thought about the specific quality of being looked at by someone who had spent 5 years learning the questions, so they would be ready when the person who had the answers walked in. She thought about the granary, the salt infiltration, the original lime mortar doing its patient sacrificial work, giving itself up course by course so the stone behind it could stay whole. She lay in the dark and she did not sleep well, which was honest. She already knew where this was going. She had known since January, if she was being accurate, since a balcony and a man in a threshold who had looked at her situation and made a decision, and the decision had landed over her shoulders before she had assembled a sentence to meet it. 3 buttons. She already knew. She stopped not knowing sometime before the harbor outside her window lightened into morning, and in the morning she got up and made coffee, and went to her drafting table and opened the granary files, and the coat was on the hook where she had left it, and she looked at it once before she opened the first file. Once was sufficient. She had known since January.